Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us tonight to enjoy the Lowestoft History Sessions, episode number 19. Of course, as ever, these sessions feature Mr. Ivan Bunn, our local Lowestoft historian, and this evening's title is Aspects of Lowestoft's History, Part 2, or Part 2, as I guess they say in France or Canada or any other French-speaking parts of the world. I'm rambling, so I'm going to get straight on and say for everybody that enjoyed the last session, which was 2 weeks ago, and that was the first part of Lowestoft's history, you will enjoy this one even more so. It's fascinating work. I've looked through some of the slides, which Ivan very kindly furnished me with, and like I say, they're a doozy, whatever a doozy is. So if you're wondering what this is, perhaps this is the first time you've stumbled upon this channel on YouTube or found it on our Facebook page, you might be wondering what on earth's going on. Well, as the title suggests, these are live stream sessions all about Lowestoft's history. And Ivan Bunn is our local historian, and he's done all 18 episodes so far. Most of those you can find on YouTube, and all of them you can find again on our Facebook pages, either the Rogues Shanty Chorus or the Rogues Shanty Boys. It's up to you. Whichever medium you prefer is fine by us. Now, if you've enjoyed this before and you know what a great deal this is, would you please consider clicking share? It means that we can reach a broader audience, and it will be shared amongst your page on your feed to your family and friends and everybody that follows you. And it means that we can get that message about how great and how interesting the history of Lowestoft is, like I say, to a wider audience, to more people, to people that perhaps have forgotten that we're broadcasting or not come across us before at all. So if you would click share, we would be very, very grateful of that. Thank you very much. In the meantime, don't forget to comment on this page if you can. That would be great. Some comments we've had already is one from Chris Collins. She says, evening Ivan and everyone. Evening Chris, thank you for joining us. Carly Franklin joins us, but she says, hey Paul, you are pixeled, which I was trying to keep that secret, Carly, so please don't tell everyone that I'm pixeled, only in the evenings. Jackie Draper says, evening all. Good evening, Jackie. Good evening, Barry. Hope you're both well. Chris Collins is straight in there. She said, I've shared it. She shared it. Thank you very much, Chris. Really appreciate that. And Hazel Rumble, another one of our regular contributors, says, evening all. Hazel from Peterborough. But my daughter and I are in Lowestoft today. Oh, well, you're very welcome. And glad to have you in our fair county and the wonderful town of Lowestoft. So thank you, Hazel, for joining us. Now, as I said, the Rogues Shanty Chorus, we are the host of these Lowestoft history sessions, hosting the wonderful Ivan Bunn. The Rogues Shanty Chorus is a group of singers, and we meet in Lowestoft. We are a group that celebrates the cultural and musical heritage of Lowestoft and Waveney through the wonderful genre and songs that were available to the industry of the fishing industry in that town. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, I'd love to show you a picture of the Rogues Shanty Chorus, because they look like this on a good day. This was one of our most recent performances at the Seagull Theatre in Lowestoft. We meet there every other Tuesday when we can meet there. At the moment, we've just started up again, and we can only accept 24 of our regular rogues due to social distancing. And we are looking forward to seeing them again in person tomorrow night. So that's what we normally look like, and that's a project that is very kindly supported by the People's Health Trust. Now they sponsor us through a program called the Active Communities program, and very lucky and grateful we are indeed to have them on board. They've been supporting us for well over a year now, and they've made it so that we can continue to reach out and engage with our community even during lockdown since March, when everything was just shut and we weren't able to see anyone. They made it possible that we could reach out to them online and still engage with them and still feel like we all had a little bit of sanity left. And like I said, we appreciate their help very much, the People's Health Trust through the Active Communities Programme. So thank you very much to them. But anyway, back to some of our comments before we welcome Ivan Bunn once more. And what do we have so far? We have Diana Carver, one of my favourites. She says, "Evening all, hope you're all well." Well, we're well enough, Diana. Hope you're well too. Chris Collins gave me a whoop whoop. I think that's what she meant anyway. And my old friend James Wright, "Evening all, just shared to my newsfeed." Thanks very much, Jim. Really appreciate that. Kevin Fox, "Good evening, everyone, from a cold Aberdeen." That does well. It's lovely up in Aberdeen, but it's cold enough here, Kevin. So I dread to think how cold it is. But I hope you're having a lovely time. And thank you very much for tuning in and joining us tonight. As I said, this evening we are joined by Ivan Bunn with Aspects of Lowestoft History Continued. It's the second part. And would you please welcome my friend and yours, Ivan Bunn. Hi, Ivan. How are you?
Good evening, Paul. Not too bad, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Chris, Carly, Jackie, Barry, Hazel, Diana, James, and Kevin so far. Lovely to have you on board, as always. Hope you enjoy the evening. I hope you've had a good 2 weeks since we last met. Well, kind of met.
Yeah, it does. Well, it does. It's very congenial now, isn't it? It's familiar and cozy. I like it very much. So. Aspects of Lowestoft's history. Last, a fortnight ago, you filled us in on a lot of the backstory, going way back, all the way to the Viking Hluva. You mentioned, or Hluvas, and how that could be a possible explanation of the name of Lowestoft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Really, this is aspects of Lowestoft history, going right back to Domesday Book and before, and coming right through literally to the present day. I call it aspects because it's not a continuous history. We'd have to spend about 3 years every week to do a continuous history. So I picked out sort of highlights of the history of the town, watching how it expanded, how it grew, how it prospered, and at times how and why it declined. But when I start, which we will in a few moments, I'm just going to rewind slightly just to before where I finished a fortnight ago, just to pick up the thread. And also to say that if you missed the first half, as Paul's already said, you can pick that up on Facebook or on YouTube if you want to fill in the earlier stories.
Yeah, always available. Like I said, most of them available on YouTube and all of them available on our Facebook pages. But don't do it now. For God's sake, don't do it now. Stick around because Ivan Bunn's got another fantastic slideshow presentation titled Aspects of Lowestoft History Continued. And without further ado, if you're ready, Ivan, I'll hand it over to you and start.
Ready when you are.
Okay, my man, and I hope you all enjoy it tonight. And I shall see you when we are at the end.
Yeah, thank you. So anyway, as I just said, I'm just going to rewind very briefly to get a perspective on what we're doing. So as I said, this is Aspects of Lowestoft's History, Part 2. I always hold my breath at this point to make sure the show was working. It should be. And it did 15 minutes ago when we did a test run. So I have every confidence. Yep, here we go then. So it's Aspects of Lowestoft History. Well, some aspects, not every aspect of it, of course. And this is Part 2. I just go right back to basically where I started with the community that was here. So Lowestoft, as I played that last time, was called Lowestoft, and it means the homestead or house of a family, an extended family called Hoover or Hluva, and it combined with a smaller community called Eightfoot. situated near the parish church of Lowestoft. So that's the roots of the town, but there is evidence that there's been settlement here of some way, shape or form since prehistoric times. So we push on, and I'm going to pick up now, as I said, where we left off 2 weeks ago. Again, hoping that the slideshow works correctly. Yeah. So we're at the beginning of the 19th century. I finished up at the end of the 18th century, and I've gone into the 19th century. I did do this a little bit. Some of the slides you'll see in the next few. I did cover briefly just before I finished last week. So there, if you can see that nice and clearly, I hope you can. That's a late 18th century view of the town of Lowestoft, as seen from the sea. And because I can't read the captions too well, so you can see on the extreme right, we've got the high lighthouse, all the houses along the cliff top, the site of the town chamber, and along on the beach, we've got the embryonic beach village, which I shall talk about a little bit more. And you can see by the beginning of the 19th century, Lowestoft was quite a very prosperous and bustling town. So if we can push on to the next slide now. So I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. I covered this in depth in the talk some time back now, but by Act of Parliament in 1827, House of Property Act of Parliament, the first harbour was built at Lowestoft. The harbour really, as you can see from this map, this is 1832 map of Lowestoft. The town, obviously, on the right-hand side, the long turnpike road, built in 1785, stretching southwards into Kirkley and Pakefield beyond. The extensive deans, the highlight, the lowlight, the back streets of the town, and to the west of them, the parish church of St Margaret, where in Saxon times, certainly at the time of Domesday, 1086, that's where the first settlements were. And you can see the harbour, in actual fact, there was no resemblance to the harbour that we have here today. It was basically a cut through the sand dunes with a sea lock and a bridge, and the harbour itself was actually in Lake Louding itself. The outer harbour, as we can see in a little while, was developed in the ensuing decades. So that's basically the harbour, the embryonic harbour at Lowestoft. And you can also see along the turnpike road to the south of the old town, you can see the indications of the expansion of the town with a few buildings that have been erected beside the turnpike. So if we go on to the next aspect of the history of Lowestoft, coming forward. If we could just have the next slide, please, Paul. One man, I don't want to dwell too much on him, not because I don't like him. The maker of modern Lowestoft, Samuel Morton Peto, later Sir Samuel Morton Peto, he came to Lowestoft in 1844. He'd already built a railway line. He's a great railway entrepreneur and builder. He'd already built a railway line from Great Yarmouth through to Norwich, and then on through Cambridge to London. And he proposed building a railway line from Lowestoft to link up with the Yarmouth-Norwich line at Reedham, so that people, but in particular fish and goods, could be gotten easily by train to Norwich and then hence further west to the Midlands. He formed the Lowestoft, Reedham Harbour and Railway Company by Act of Parliament, and the railway line was duly built. He also expanded the town southwards, particularly constructed the seafront esplanade and the mansions there, which I again will touch on in a moment. So if we can quickly flick to the next slide, please, Paul. So this is the Act of Parliament, a copy of the Act of Parliament, which was passed in 1845 to enable a railway line to be constructed from Lowestoft through to Reedham and then to Norwich, as I said, on through to the Midlands and down to London via Cambridge. The railway line itself opened on the 1st of July 1847. The Lowestoft Reedham Railway opened for passenger traffic then. There's a lovely print painting of the type of train you would have seen. And of course, the next thing that came along was in 1859, the Lowestoft to Beccles Railway. That linked up with the Yarmouth to London line, and so there was a direct route then from Lowestoft through Beccles down to London. And here you can see the town as it was in 1832, and we just working down from the top of the map. You can see the broad expanse of beams separating the town from most of the town from the sea. There's the old town, the beach village, the embryonic beach village. Again, I should talk about that in a little while. There's the Battery Green. Today we still have Battery Green Road. There's the battery with the green in front of it. A very large estate with one house in it called the Grove. And then we come further south to the entrance to the new harbour. And then the new suburbs on the side of the Turnpike and St. Peter's Chapel of Ease to St. Margaret's. The church being 3/4 of a mile inland from the town. It was difficult sometimes to get parishioners in bad weather to go to church, so this Chapel of Ease was built on the road that was known as Beccles Road at the time, because it was built to take it to Beccles, but eventually it became renamed and it is now modern day St. Peter's Street, although the chapel has disappeared. So that's the time basically in 1832. So we move on to the next slide, please. Now, until the building of the harbour, all of the fishing in Lowestoft was done from the beach. The boats were launched from the beach. The fish was landed on the beach. The fishing boats would anchor in the roads. That's the strips of deeper water close to the beach, and the fish would be ferried ashore. Once the harbour was built, all of this would change, not instantaneously by a long chalk, but as the harbour grew and the fishing industry grew, the number of boats sailing out of Lowestoft grew. So here is the harbour entrance in 1830, leading you through into Lake Lothing. By 1856, the Norfolk Railway Company, of which Samuel Morton Peter was a director, expanded the harbour, and by 1876 it was growing quite rapidly. More and more fishing boats were using it, and by 1886 the herring and mackerel dock was opened and built, and 1906 the Hamilton dock was built. So as you can see, that very over a fairly short period of time, the harbour grew exponentially to the number of fishing boats, and vice versa. The more fishing boats that came, the more they had to expand the harbour. And this is the completed harbour in 1906, and basically it's exactly the same layout as we see today, minus most of the fishing boats, of course. Hamilton Dock, that was named after Lord Hamilton, who opened the dock. There has been sort of a tradition that because you come down to Hamilton Dock, down Old Nelson Street, that it was named for Lady Hamilton, Nelson's mistress, but it's not. It's named for Lord Hamilton, who was the director of the Great Eastern Railway Company that actually it inherited the docks from the Norfolk Railway Company. So this is the growth of the harbour. And of course, as I was saying, the harbour grew, the number of boats grew, and we can see, if you go to the next slide, please, Paul, how the fleet at Lowestoft. So here's a wonderful view of the harbour. And in 1800, there were approximately 50 fishing boats sailing off the beach at Lowestoft Bay. The 1880, approximately 450 fishing boats now using the harbour, and by 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, there were approximately 800 fishing boats, drifters and trawlers registered at Lowestoft. That's not including during the herring season, October, November, when hundreds more fishing boats from Scotland joined the Lowestoft fleet. So in a very short period of time, the harbour grew. And 1852, the inner harbour, exports and imports, and in 1852, Lowestoft imported oxen, horses, sheep and pigs, and that continued. Other imports included grain, oil cake, cheese, coal, timber, stone, oil, silk, wool, hemp, slate, and that wonderful product, guano, which in actual fact is whose quantities of dried seagull droppings that were sold to farmers to plough into the land to improve the quality of the soil. So even in 1852, the town was busy. The next big improvement to the town, we've looked at the past in the last slideshow as to who governed, and if you like, who ran and managed the town. There was a board of trustees called the Commissioners who did some of the running of the town, but it was all very piecemeal. There was the church still had a say in what happened in the town. In 1854, an Act of Parliament was applied for and granted, the Lowestoft Improvement Act. This made really the first town council and everything but name, and Lowestoft's first town hall was built. It was built on the site of an earlier townhouse and chapel erected in 1696, which in turn was built on the site of an earlier chapel of ease to St Margaret's church, the parish church, a pre-Reformation chapel. And the improvement commissioners had the right, had to be elected by the ratepayers. They had the right to borrow money to improve the town. And as I said, they ran the town more or less as an incorporated borough. They didn't have quite the authority that they would eventually get, or the town would eventually get 25 years later. But again, I'll come on to that in a moment. So the town is expanding. As the town expands, as the fishing fleet expands, it's said that for every man that went to sea, there were at least 10 men and women employed the shoreside industry, supporting that man and the vessel that he sailed in. So again, as the fleet expands exponentially, so does the town grow as more and more people come from outside to find work and employment in a town that's growing rapidly. We'll have a look at population growth in a little while. So if we move on to the next slide. In the parish of Kirkley, which under the Improvement Act was included as part of Lowestoft and became known as South Lowestoft, the ecclesiastical parish stayed the same, but it was now being run by the Improvement Commissioners as their South Ward, and the seaside resort became very prosperous and a favourite watering place in the summer from people from all over. Where only a short while ago there had been nothing but sand dunes and the beach, within a very short time a new esplanade was built with very high quality housing, a beautiful hotel known as the Royal Hotel. That opened in the late 1840s, and suddenly Lowestoft became not only a busy port, fishing port, it also became a very popular seaside town. And of course the railway also meant that people could travel to Lowestoft easily from London and beyond if they wanted to come and holiday here. And so this is the Royal Hotel. If you just go on to the next slide. The South Pier, here's an engraving of it here, which was the southern pier of the fish docks and outer harbour, was not involved in the fishing industry at all. That became a it became a pier for the public to promenade along. There was a reading room was built on it. You can see it there in the middle, ready ornate gates. And here is a very early photograph of the entrance to South Pier. You had to pay a small charge to get in, and again it became very, very popular in the summer months, as did the reading room that you can see on the left in the distance. So the South Pier became a focal point, as did the new esplanade. And if you go to the next slide, we can see the esplanade itself, I hope. Thank you. So here's a nice print of the esplanade. All of this was designed, was created the grandiose plan of Samuel Morton Peto, 450 yards long. And you have to remember that when work started here in 1844, there were nothing but open sand dunes. And the first stage had to be to build a sea wall, a 10-foot high sea wall, fill in behind the back of that to raise the level of the beach to the level of the road to the west, and then the promenade was laid out on top of that, 450 yards long. It stretched from the Royal Plain, Parade Road north, and all the way along to where Parade Road south is. Their names, obviously, because that's the only way to get onto the seafront, to the esplanade, and there were very, very high class lodging houses built overlooking the sea, and it became the in place. And the builders were the Lucas brothers, Charles and Thomas Lucas, probably one of the biggest building companies in England during the 19th century. their headquarters was at Belvedere in Lambeth in London, but they also had a very big builder's yard in Lowestoft, and the road leading to it became known as Belvedere Road. That's Belvedere Road as we still know it today. So Charles and Thomas Lucas did work, and just about all the bricks to build the lodging houses, guest houses, hotels were all made at the brickworks at Somerleyton. So you can see by the mid-19th century, Lowestoft was really, really a bit of a cat's whisker. I don't know if you noticed the last picture of the Royal Hotel that I brought to print. The early ones were only 3 stories high. By the 1860s, a 4th story had been built on it. Such was the demand for accommodation. And here we see the Royal Hotel with the 4th story. So we push on to the next slide. I've got quite a lot of ground to cover this evening. So 1832 map of Lowestoft. And now if we go best part of 50 years, you can see how much the town had expanded in that short period of time. And here, just to explain what's going on, there's Bellevue Park. That opened in 1876. There's the Town Hall of 1860 in the middle, where the present day Town Hall is. By the 1880s, there was gas being supplied from the gas works to light the streets and the houses of the people that could afford it. The South Pier, the St John's Church. I'm going to come on to South Lowestoft, Kirkley, shortly as to how that expanded. St John's Church was needed because the population was expanding so much. Kirkley Old Parish Church was fairly ruinous and out of the way, and so a new church was built, St John's Church. The railway stations sitting there are linked with the West, the Midlands and London, and there the back streets now to the west of the Turnpike Road that you can see the Roman Hill Estate as it became known. We still have Roman Road and the Roman Hill School, so-called Roman Hill because when the roads were being laid out, they discovered there, the workmen discovered there some Roman remains, pottery, coins, the remains of a statue, and what was probably the remains of a Roman villa. Then there's the Alexandra Estate being laid out. There's very few houses at this time, 1885, on the Alexandra Estate, named for Princess Alexandra, and of course Alexandra Road lives on there, and then of course further to the north of that, to the south of St Margaret's Road, is the St Margaret's Estate. St Margaret's Road was originally known as Church Lane. It became renamed St Margaret's Road, and the roads that grew up immediately to the south became known as the St Margaret's Estate. So that's basically Lowestoft, the town of Lowestoft in 1885 as it grew and prospered. So we'll come on to Kirkley in a moment. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the parish of Kirkley. This is the parish before this is 1803. There is no harbour yet into Lake Lothing, but the green area was common land. All that common land was enclosed in 1803, and you can see by 1878, that's 75 years on, the whole of Kirkley, South Lowestoft as it was often referred to, but growing up in Kirkley I still call it Kirkley. I am a Kirkleyite at heart. You can see that where once there was either common land and open fields, now there is extensive roads that have been built at the seafront that you can see towards the top. On the right, the esplanade, the buildings flanking the esplanade, the back streets around St John's Church, St John's Road, if you're familiar with the area, as one of the very first back streets of Kirkley to be laid out. There's a railway line now going through from the South Quay, a goods line going all the way, joining up with the line between Beccles and Lowestoft. So the town is really, really expanding rapidly. And so again, with expansion becomes change, if you like, in the management and the running of the town. Sorry, excuse me. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Now, in August 1885, Lowestoft was granted a royal charter to become an incorporated borough under the Municipal Corporations Act of 1882. This enabled an incorporated borough to be set up. Here is a copy, not the original, of the Charter of Incorporation granted by Queen Victoria to Lowestoft to have its own incorporated borough. That meant it was a totally self-governing body, and it had a mayor, it had the aldermen, and it had the burgesses. Under the Act of Parliament, or under the Royal Charter, I should say, a total of 24 councillors, 6 from each of the wards of the borough, which coincided mainly with the improvement commissioners. Many of the improvement commissioners were actually elected to the new borough council. So there were 6. So there was 24 councillors, 6 from each of the 4 wards, and the first municipal election was held on Monday the 1st of November 1885. No less than 32 candidates put their names up and stood for election across the 4 wards. The elections were duly held, the 24 councillors were appointed, and the first council meeting was held on the 9th of November 1885, at which an alderman and a mayor were appointed. Now, the method of governance was an election which was very good. I don't know if you can see the second schedule underneath there, how they staggered elections so that there was continuity in the town council. So after a year, 1/3 of the councillors in each ward who were elected by the smallest number had to go out of office, and there had to be another election. The following year, 1887, remember this is 1885, the town councillors formed. 1/3 of the councillors in each ward who had been elected by the next smallest amount go out of office, and there's an election, and the remaining third in 1888. Now the aldermen, there was 8 aldermen appointed. They had a much longer tenure, so it would be till 1880. I'm trying to see the date there. 1888. That half of the aldermen had to stand down and be others elected, perhaps the same ones, and the remaining 1/2 of the aldermen, they had to go out of office in 1891. So you can see through the aldermen and the electoral system for the town council, for the borough of Lowestoft, you can see that this ensured continuity in the government, the governing and the management of the town's affairs. And the aldermen were purposely, it's from the old Anglo-Saxon word alderman, which is elderman, which meant older, longer-standing members of a community who had a special place because of their knowledge and experience. They would stay, they're kind of like the glue, if you like, that holds the whole council together, headed by the mayor. And so 1885 onwards, the town is now being governed legally and completely by the town council. And as we shall see, that would continue for a fair amount of time. It's a really important watershed in the history of the town, because it could now make its own the town could pass its own bylaws. It had its own police court, and it could basically run its own affairs. It handled education, public health, sea defence, building control, you name it. It did everything that a town council should be able to do. Unlike the old improvement commissioners that it replaced, it did have a role to play, a positive role to play in the town. And of course, the people who usually got elected, unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps, were the great and the good of Lowestoft, the businessmen, the wealthy businessmen, would be the ones that usually got elected. And in some ways that was good for the town, because they had a vested interest in making the town work and prosper, because the more the town worked and prospered, the bigger it grew, the more prosperity they got in return. So we go to the next slide, please. So we had a mayor, as I said. Here is our first mayor, Alderman William Youngman, Justice of the Peace. There he is with his good wife. And he's a perfect example of the type of people that were being elected to the town council. Only 24 of them. He was one of the largest, he owned one of the largest breweries in Lowestoft, the Eagle Brewery in Rankscore, a very large brewery. Eventually it was amalgamated with another brewery owned by Mr. Preston, and we got Youngman and Preston's the brewers. He was one of the wealthiest townsmen, and he was appointed by the town council to be the town's first mayor. In 1913, the borough was granted its first coat of arms. Could we just go back to that slide, do you think, Paul? Please, I'm sorry. It jumped the gun. Yeah, that's the first coat of arms, and as you can see, break of day, or sunrise is the motto. There's the sunrise on the shield. The chevron has 3 plates representing Lowestoft porcelain. There's the Tudor rules each side of the ancient crown, recognising that Lowestoft once belonged to the crown. And above the helmet at the top is St. Margaret of Antioch, or portrayal of St. Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of Lowestoft, and of course St. Margaret's Church is named after her. So this was the official coat of arms borne by the borough of Lowestoft. It's no longer used, I understand, although sometimes I've noticed they put it up on notice boards. So anyway, we come on to the next aspect, is the beach village. I'm not going to talk too much about the beach village, that's a story in itself. The first houses on the beach, the beams were built in the late 1790s. Up until then, there hadn't been any. This is in 1835. We're looking down at that sporadic house, and as we go through the years, you can see the beach village slowly expanded. Very, very piecemeal was the beach village. It wasn't a very orderly construction, simply because all of the deans belonged to the lord of the manor, and he could grant bits of land to people who asked for them. So by the 1930s, as you can see here, the beach village has expanded rapidly, and there's over 3,000 men, women and children now living on the beach, as they call it. And of course, by the 1960s and 70s, the beach village literally had disappeared, given over to commerce. Bird's Eye Foods in particular, as they still do today, owned much of the built on much of the old beach village land and the deans. Most of the old roads disappeared, and the beach village itself disappeared. And only a few weeks ago, or 4 months ago now, the last of the old gasometers from the gasworks was dismantled down on the site of the old beach village, and that link now with the beach village has disappeared. And I just put a little collection of photographs up there showing some of the scenes from the beach village. As I said, don't know how long we're going to continue doing these talks, but I do have a beach village history talk that I could present to you. So I'm not going to cover too much of the beach history, simply to say it started, the embryonic beach village started, the Lord of the Manor started to grant plots of land to build fish houses and later houses in the 1790s, and it, a bit like Topsy, it just grew and grew from there. And like so much, eventually it outlived its life for various reasons, and a big, they called it the sun clearance operation in the 1950s and 60s. The whole of the beach village was basically flattened. So push on from the beach village to the next slide, please. So we're now coming into the 20th century. There's a lovely aerial view looking across the beach village to the town at the top of the cliff and the suburbs beyond. Down bottom right you can see the seawall, the beach and the sea. And so what we want to do now, the year 1913 was the peak of the herring fishing. And it's recorded, and we know that in the autumn of 1913, that's the herring season, 770 drifters, a mixture of steam and sail, 250 from Lowestoft and 420 Scottish sailed out of the port, out of Lowestoft, and a record catch of 535,000 cran of herring were landed. A cran was a weight, in actual fact, in a basket, and approximately 1,000 herring made up one cran. So I don't know what your math is like, but from that you should be able to work out. It was the most prolific landing of herring ever in the port of Lowestoft. Excuse me, I just have another little sip of water. And there again, taken that same year, that's just showing some of the herring that were piled up waiting to be sold that year. And it was a bonanza year. The catch by today's standards literally fetched millions and millions of pounds in money, that is. And so what happened to it? Well, again, the impact on the fishing on the beach village area was quite intense. And if we go to the next slide, this is a view across what were known as the pickling plots. There were tens of thousands of barrels of herring being pickled and shipped around the world, and this is a view of some of them. It became known as Klondiking. After the gold rush in the 1890s, this is when the Klondiking Lowestoft started, the Yukon gold rush in, I think it was 1895-96, which was a bonanza year for finding gold. And the Lowestoft herring industry, it became known, the shoreside became known as Klondiking. The herring were pickled in literally hundreds of thousands of large wooden barrels and shipped all over the world. That, of course, came to an end quite abruptly in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. Many of the men who sailed in those drifters and trawlers out of Lowestoft were Royal Naval Reserve men, and they were called up quite often with their vessels for war duty. And many of the trawlers went on mine sweeping exercises and were armed. Other trawlers were armed with guns to protect this fishing fleet from German submarines that were terrorizing the fishermen of the North Sea. From Lowestoft and elsewhere, the fishing continued in Lowestoft with a much diminished fleet, and German submarines were sinking many of our fishing boats, and so armed trawlers were sent out to protect the fleet. On the 15th of August, I've used this as an example. This is just one example of the thousands of brave fishermen who sailed. 15th of August 1917, Skipper Tom Crisp and his vessel, the Nelson, was attacked by a German submarine in the North Sea, and the vessel was badly damaged. Skipper Crisp stayed by the gun mounted on the bow of the ship, engaged the submarine. He was hit by and mortally wounded, but he continued at the bow of the ship, and he was, because of this, it enabled the rest of his crew, including his son, to escape to safety in the ship's small boat. And Skipper Crisp stayed on board of the vessel, firing the gun, although mortally wounded, to the last moment, and he went down with the ship, and his body was never found. And for this action, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. He'd already got the Distinguished Service Cross, as you could see in this earlier photograph of him. He was, in fact, a long-term Lowestoft skipper, Royal Naval Reserve, who had been mobilised for the war. And he, in fact, if we go to the next slide, please, we can see that he actually became a national hero. And here is the front page of the Daily Mirror, singing his praise, rightly, his heroics, and he got mentioned and praised. His bravery was spoken of in Parliament by the Prime Minister, held up as a virtue of the sea-going traditions of this country. Less remembered is this boat, the Ethel and Millie. She was there at the same time as Skipper Crisp was killed. This vessel with its crew, and here's a photograph of its crew, all Lowestoft fishermen, or had been until they were called up into the Royal Naval Reserve. It was attacked by a German submarine. The vessel, the men were allowed to get off the boat, off their sailing boat, the Ethel and Millie, and they were taken on board the German submarine, and the Ethel and Millie was then sunk. They were last seen from other British fishing boats being lined up on the deck of the submarine. Nobody knows what happened to them. They were never seen again, and they were never heard of again. At the end of the war, they were not prisoners of war, and as I said, they were never seen again. One version of the story is that they were left standing on deck when the German submarine submerged. There's no evidence of that, and they were left to drown. There's another good probability that they were taken on board the submarine. The German Navy, the cruisers of submarines, quite often, if the fishing boats didn't put up a fight, if the armed ones, that they would allow the crews actually to get off the fishing boats, and then the crew of the U-boat would get on board of the fishing boat, take anything of value they could find, and then put explosives on board of the fishing boat and blow it up. But they didn't treat the crews of mostly anyway, the crews of the British fishing boats too badly and on the whole. So there's a possibility, a probability, in fact, that the crew of the Ethel Millie with Skipper Manning were taken on board of the submarine to be returned to be taken to Germany to be interned as POWs, and that the submarine was actually sunk in action somewhere where the crew was still on board. We'll never know their fate, but they're again representative of the Lowestoft fishermen who did so much in the First World War. So push on to the next slide, please. I can only do certain aspects of the war. I could spend the next 2 hours talking about it. One episode that is still talked about in Lowestoft is on the 25th of April 1916, when a fleet of large German warships sailed slowly past Lowestoft and shelled the town, the bombardment of Lowestoft, as it was called. And on the left is one of the houses that was hit. This was a private house in Sandringham Road. Sadly, 3 children were killed here during the bombardment. Fortunately, the numbers of people actually killed were pretty low considering the intensive bombardment. The premises on the right-hand photograph, these are in London Road South, opposite what today is the Kirkley Centre, and you can see the immense damage done. In some ways, Lowestoft was very fortunate, and if we go on to the next slide, please. This is just a cross-section of some of the buildings that were hit there. Kirkley Run, as you can see, Stephen Street, Cleveland Road, St Leonard's Road. These are only some that were hit. But some of the shells that were being fired at the time apparently weren't high explosive. They were solid, large armor-piercing shells that tended to just punch holes through the buildings and collapse them rather than explode on contact. But here you can see just 4, and you can see how diverse the shelling was. It seems to have been totally random because you've got shells falling on Kirkley Run, St Leonard's Road in South Lowestoft in Kirkley, Stephen Street, Cleveland Road in Kirkley. This is only a few of the places that were hit. What isn't recorded is the fact that for weeks and weeks after that bombardment, every night thousands of women, mainly women and older men, evacuated Lowestoft in case the Germans came back, and they slept in barns and in the open fields far to the west of Lowestoft. And the school records of Lowestoft show that in right through May, even the beginning of June, school attendances dropped in some cases by 50% as mothers and families took their children out of the town for safety further afield as far as Bundy and Beccles in case the Germans returned and attacked the town again. And again, when I worked in the record office, we had some letters in there from a local teacher to his brother up in North Norfolk, saying that it was a day after the bombardment. He was about to cross the bridge, and a car or a lorry backfired, and it sent people screaming and running over, running to trying to take cover. A number of men, possibly soldiers on leave, actually built for cover on the ground. And so it was a very, very unnerving experience for everybody in the town. It was just a hint of what was to come less than 20, just over 25 years later. So we'll push on again then, please, to the next slide. And post-war, of course, there was a big decline in the number of ships sailing out there, post the First World War, sailing out of Lowestoft, many of which had been lost in naval service. But in actual fact, of the fishing boats that were lost, who were still legally out fishing, nothing to do with the war, there was 177 fishing boats attacked and sunk by the Germans between 1914 and 1918, and 129 men and boys were actually killed. In the 1930s, I'm going to jump forward to the 1930s just for a moment. We had the town hall, so-called town hall riot, organised by the local branch of the National Unemployed Workers Movement. Now, the Depression hit 1929, 1930, and by 1933, over 25% of the population of the country were unemployed, and the local branch of the National Unemployed Workers Movement came to the town hall to ask the committee at the town hall. There was a committee that filled out the unemployment benefit money, which the previous year had been cut by 10% through government instructions. The North Area Guardians Committee, and three men in particular, the chairman and the vice chairman, including the chairman and the vice chairman of the unemployers workers movement, they asked to be able to present a petition to the committee to argue that their benefits should be increased because they couldn't live on the pay, really. The benefit they were getting, their families, so I'm just checking something here, their families couldn't really subsist on that sort of money. The committee refused to see them, and we call them the ringleaders, if you like, decided they should do something about it. They harangued a growing crowd with speeches. They sung songs, they made speeches, and they decided if the committee wouldn't let them into the town hall, they would take the town hall by storm. And eventually, after much shouting and chanting and singing, they actually stormed the town hall. And the police apparently had been warned that this was going to happen, and they had got 50 policemen stationed inside the town hall. They quickly dispelled the so-called riot, and a total of 23 men were arrested. They were immediately sent down to the police station in Regent Road, and a police court was convened, and they were held overnight in the cells there. The next morning, 3 other men who had been involved in the so-called riot were caught. 2 of them were arrested in their homes, and the 3rd one gave himself up. They were taken to the police court, and there was a hearing. It's a long story. On the left, you can see the list of all the men who were involved. They came from various parts of the town, from various trades and occupations, all unemployed men. And the photograph you can see is in Compass Street beside the town hall before the town hall was attacked, and I put that word in inverted commas. And here is the chairman of the unemployed workers movement haranguing the crowd and trying to encourage them to attack the town hall. The movement itself was actually, in fact, had been set up in 1821 by the British Communist Party, and there was a strong, very strong socialist, if not communist, feel to the whole thing. One of the men, whose name was Glimmer, William James Glimmer, who was the chairman of the local unemployed workers movement. He addressed the crowd as comrades, and in some of his speeches he referred to down with the caps. He shouted out to the people, down with the capitalist class and the police. There was a kind of a bit of an era of almost revolution there. When they convened the next day at the police court, hundreds and hundreds of people turned out to harangue the court. There's now 26 men are being tried at the police court, and there was a great crowd outside, as you can see in the lower photograph here, haranguing, shouting, cheering. The wives of 2 of the men who had been arrested attacked a policeman, and they too were arrested. The outcome of the hearing was that all of the men should be bound over and in Norwich prison for a week, and then there would be a full hearing at the court in the full court in Lowestoft in a week's time. This is on the 8th of May 1933. So I'm just trying to, it's the 16th of May 1933, the full hearing in front of the magistrates. The 2 of the teenagers who were involved were discharged on probation. That left 24 men. 18 of them were released on bail on promise of good behaviour, but 6 who were the ringleaders were in actual fact committed to stand trial at Bury St Edmund's Assize on the 29th of May, and the trial took place. and it seemed to be quite a laid-back trial, I have to say. The police dropped the charge of riotous assembly, which was quite a draconian law if you were tried under that, and the men were accused of attending an unlawful assembly. Some of the policemen had actually been injured in it, but it was decided that they couldn't prove that any of the men, the 6 men, including the chairman and the vice chairman of the movement, had been involved in attacking the policemen. So those charges were dropped. And in the end, the judge decided that the men wouldn't go to prison. He discharged them. They were bound over, I think the word is, £5 each to go back to Lowestoft under police surveillance or under the superintendence of the police, and to give their word that they wouldn't take part in or arrange any other such protest. The men all apologised to the court and said that they had been very hot-headed. They gave their word that they would never do it again, and they were sent, the 6% back to Lowestoft. So the riot kind of wasn't a riot in the end. It sort of fizzled out, and but certainly feelings were running high. There was an outcome of this, as there had been in the 1920s. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Paul. And here you can see in the 1920s, after the First World War, they were making work. The council were finding work with government grants. Kensington Bathing Station and Kensington Gardens were built, as you can see in the 2 left-hand and the top right-hand picture. In the 1930s, after this so-called riot and protest, the town council borrowed money to have the esplanade, the lower esplanade at Lowestoft, paved and made good, and many of the unemployed men in Lowestoft were actually employed on that work. So perhaps the so-called town hall riot did have some effect. Anyway, we're going to push on to the next slide, please. Now, the population by the mid-1930s, here's my chart just to show in 10-year leaps how the population grew. I've included the population of Kirkley in this because after 1911, when the census was taken, and this is all from the census records, Lowestoft and Kirkley became combined. So these are the totals through to the 1931 census. And as you can see, there was a tremendous growth in 130 years in the population of, we'll call it Greater Lowestoft, North and South Lowestoft. There's a drop in 1931 compared with 1921 for some reasons. There must be good reasons for it. And of course, the next follow-on, by the 1939, the Great Depression was basically behind the country and the town, but the Second World War started. Again, I'm not able to cover all the aspects of it. Here's just a few, a snapshot of photographs taken in Lowestoft during the Second World War. There are a couple of aspects that I intend to cover. Excuse me. Sparrow's Nest Park opened in 1898-99, and in 1939, the end of 1939 into 1940, it was, as I'm sure as many of you know, it was in actual fact taken over by the Admiralty, and the Royal Naval Patrol Service had it as its headquarters. And here is a view inside the park, looking from the present where the present day bandstand is. And HMS Europa was the administrative headquarters of the complete Royal Naval Patrol Service, and it administered over the course of the war 60,000 men and 6,000 vessels. And this was all done from its headquarters in Sparrow's Nest. And there were all, as I'm sure you know, all naval bases, whether they be ships at sea or land bases, are always Her Majesty's ships. So this is Her Majesty's ship Europa. But there were 4 divisions within Europa. Europa was the administrative division, and there were 4 other subdivisions, if you like, and so there was HMS Martello, all in Lowestoft. This was the minesweepers engaged in keeping the North Sea shipping lanes open for the convoys going up and down the coast here. There was HMS Mantis. This was the fleet headquarters for coastal forces with motor torpedo boats, MTBs, and motor gunboats, MGBs. Again, based at Lowestoft. HMS Minos, which was for harbour defence, escort duties, and other small craft. Then there was HMS Myluden. This is for landing craft training for the Royal Marines. And in 1956, to commemorate all of the men who were lost at sea, there's 2,385 names engraved on the panels of the Royal Naval Patrol Service Memorial, erected in Bellevue Park in 1956. And this is a really important memorial to all of the men who were lost at sea during the First World War and had no grave but the sea. So go to the next slide, please. One of the reasons the town was heavily bombed, I don't know how well you can see this map, this is based on actual information. Each red dot represents a bomb falling on the town. 1940, there were 14 air raids. 1941, there were 54 air raids. 1942, 15 air raids. 1943, 8, and 1944, 3 air raids on the town. Probably because of HMS Europa's presence and the harbour being used for all of those different naval vessels, many of which, as in the First World War, were trawlers and drifters taken up by the Navy, and so the town was very heavily bombed during the war. As this map shows, you can see the intensity of the fall of bombs in the town centre. Again, there isn't time to talk about all of the air raids and the damage. It was just views within the town of some of the bomb damage incurred during the during the Second World War. The worst raid of the war was 13th of January 1942, when 2 bombs fell in the shopping centre and killed 70 people. And the bottom photograph, bottom right-hand photograph, is one taken, if you're familiar with the town, this is looking towards the marina. This is where Starbucks coffee shop now is, and the chemist shop, Waterstones. That's where the bomb was. 70 people were killed. Between January 1940 and April 1944, there were 93 bombing raids on Lowestoft. 681 high explosive bombs, 4,644 incendiary bombs, 6 parachute mines were dropped on the town, 275 people were killed, and nearly 700 were badly injured. That doesn't include all the minor injuries, of course. So the town was quite heavily bombed. The Lowestoft district, that was just the town, the borough of Lowestoft, between January 1940 to April 1944, there were 181 bombing raids on the Lowestoft district. 1,108 high explosive bombs fell. No less than 18,238 incendiary bombs fell on the area. There were 10 parachute mines and 33 flying bombs hit the area. And the photograph that you see there, that's one of the parachute mines that didn't explode. It was buried deep in Tonning Street. I don't know if, I'm sure some of you locals know Tonning Street quite well. The houses in the background of this photograph are still there. This is towards the west end of Tonning Street, and the bomb disposal squad from the Royal Engineers, these 5 gentlemen here, were able to defuse the bomb and remove it safely from the town before it could do any damage. Had that gone off, there would have been even higher statistics for the injured and killed. So as I said, Lowestoft was heavily bombed, and we go to the next slide. We're going towards the present day now. We come to post-war Lowestoft, post-Second World War, that is. I call it Outward the Old because there, I suppose, as the town recovered from the effects of the bombing and in the Second World War, the town was looking to the future, and many of the old buildings in the town, particularly in the back streets of the old town, were pulled down in a very extensive slum clearance program in the 1950s and 60s. And here you can see just some. This is not bomb damage, by the way. These are house clearances, some clearance being carried out by the town council. Bottom left-hand picture there is St John's Church, erected in 1852 to serve the expanding parish of Kirkley, South Lowestoft. That was demolished. Many other buildings were demolished. One of the problems was the need, because up until 1976, I think it was, 77, the traffic, all the through traffic at Lowestoft still had to go down through the narrow High Street, and we had to have a bypass. The only town that had a bypass built within its precincts, but so a lot of this was to do with building and laying out the town. But the sad bit about it is the particularly in the old town, most of the very old houses, some of them dating from probably the 16th, perhaps even the 15th centuries, were all demolished and completely flattened, and the old town lost so much of its character. But there used to, I don't know if that's still a standing joke in Lowestoft, but certainly my parents' generation would say after the war that the town council destroyed far more buildings after the war than the Germans did during the war in the town. But I suppose with hindsight, it was almost like a brave new world. The war was over. the country was becoming affluent. You've never had it so good, and many progressive people were looking to the future and not looking back over their shoulders. So I'm not going to talk about the loss of heritage or anything like that. Different people have different opinions on that. If you come to the next slide, I think this is my penultimate one, and of course it's out with the old and on with the new, if you like. And here we have some photographs of some of the works that were taking place in the 1960s and 70s to modernise the town and bring it screaming into the second half of the 20th century. I'm sure some of these buildings you can recognise. It had to happen, I'm sure, particularly because of the increase in traffic. There had to be, whether it was done the right way or not, that's not the point of my talk tonight. I have my opinions, and I'm sure many of you out there watching these pictures and listening to the stories and familiar with the stories if you grew up in the town have your opinions as well. And the fishing industry declined for various reasons after the Second World War. Again, here are the statistics. The drifters continued to fish, and we can just see how the fleet of drifters in Lowestoft slowly diminished. In 1937, there's 196 drifters. 1950, 137 vessels sailing out of Lowestoft. 1954, 109 drifters. By 1961, only 7 years later, 31 vessels. And in 1968, the last drifter, known as Wiseman's, was the only remaining drifter in Lowestoft, and it made its last voyage. Of the trawling industry, 1937 there were 55 trawlers. 1950 there were 32. 1980, 27. 1984, 6 trawlers. There was a resurgence helped by government money in 1980s, late 1980s. There were 22 trawlers, but that fizzled out. They gradually fizzled out. And in 2002, 18 years ago, the last remaining trawlers were laid up, sold or scrapped, and the trawling fleet ceased to exist. And so we still have a small number of longshore, inshore, not longshore, they're called inshore boats sailing out of Lowestoft. I haven't been able to establish how many, but I don't think there's more than about half a dozen at the very most. So we go on now to the final slide and bring us right up to date. So there is the old Borough of Lowestoft, coat of arms, the incorporated Borough of Lowestoft, 1885. That would disappear in 1974 under the Local Government Act of 1972, and the Waverley District Council was set up. You just let these scroll up, and just an explanation why I brought these up. Unfortunately, this is my opinion again, unfortunately for the town, when Waverley District was set up, the old Borough of Lowestoft, the old incorporated Borough of Lowestoft, the old town council wasn't, there wasn't enough people here to make a district council under the Local Government Act of 1972. So they had to expand the boundaries and take in the outlying areas, Bungay, Beccles, Halesworth and Southwold in particular, to swell the population to make a district. And that district became known as the Waverley District. So the town council actually disappeared. Now, each of the other towns, Southwold, Bungay, Beccles, and Houseworth were actually small self-governing town councils. They weren't abolished. They just were. They kept their identity. They kept their town council, basically with the well, not basically, with the same rights as a parish council. So there was still a small corpus of people sitting in Bungay, Beccles, Houseworth, Southwold, monitoring what was happening in their town under the ruling of the Waveney District Council. Unfortunately, Lowestoft didn't do that. Lowestoft totally abolished the town council in any shape or form. The charter that created the incorporation in 1885, being a royal charter, couldn't actually be cancelled, and so the charter still exists, and it's held by a small group known as the Charter Trustees. One of the best things that could have happened, so between 1974 and 2017, there was no body that was an independent body, elected independent body, that was watching what was going on in Lowestoft. It was all down to Waveney District Council. Many of the people making decisions of the town didn't live in Lowestoft. It does make me wonder if we had kept the borough of Lowestoft as a parish council, so that Waveney District had to pass everything it wanted to do in Lowestoft through the town council, the old borough council, then perhaps we wouldn't have seen the sweeping changes that we did. But fortunately, that situation changed on the 1st of April 2017 under the reorganisation of Community Governance Order 2017, and a two-town council was constituted, complete with the mayor again, and the area it covers is almost exactly the same area that the old borough council used to cover. So finally, the town council of Lowestoft, the town of Lowestoft, does have a separate elected body now that can monitor what the district council does and has to be consulted by the district council, which is just as well, because in 2019, 1st of April last year, Waveney District Council amalgamated, I think it was Suffolk Coastal, and they created this very large East Suffolk Council. So now, although we still have representatives on East Suffolk Council from Lowestoft, there are many representatives from way down the coast deciding what happens in Lowestoft. But now, anything they want to do, planning-wise, anything else, complete with a lot of the assets that belong to Waveney District Council, now have to pass through the town council or are owned by the town council. Some of it is controversial. I'm not going to get involved in the local politics of all this, but to me it is heartening to think that once finally we got back to the position where we do have a body of elected people who are monitoring carefully what happens in the town. So I'm not going to get involved in the politics, but I thought, having traced all the way through from the manor courts, the different bodies that managed the town and made it work, I thought to bring the whole local government thing right up to date with what has happened literally within the last 2 or 3 years. With that, that is in actual fact my final slide. I hope you found all, if not parts of the talk this tonight interesting. I did warn you we're going to come right into the 21st century, but I thought it was imperative that we looked at all the aspects of the history of Lowestoft down the years, rather than just homing on a small bit, which, as you can see, I've left out thousands and thousands of other aspects that I could have included. I just picked the ones that I thought were diverse and in some ways just slightly joined up, so you could see how the town grew. Anyway, that's the end of that one.
That was great, Ivan. Thank you very much. A couple of things I noticed. One was how, well, impressive is the wrong word, but interesting. That map, I certainly found it interesting. The map of the bombs that landed across Lowestoft. It's just a sea of red dots. Really quite substantial raids, as you highlighted in those figures.
Yeah, with that map, if I could explain how that map came about. On the old Suffolk County Council website, they did actually have, and I don't think it's there anymore, it hasn't been there for years now, they did have a map of Lowestoft showing where every single bomb dropped. But I couldn't get a hard copy of it, so I got the Ordnance Survey map and painstakingly put all the little red dots on that map.
Wow.
So I think it is particularly relatively accurate.
Yeah, well, it's certainly an eye-opener, so thank you for your efforts on that. I found it fascinating. Obviously devastating at the time, but yeah, a few other things. Thank you very much for explaining Tom Crisp to me. I've often wondered where the name came from.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and also on the same subject, the name I really need to know is of the dog in the picture of the Ethel and Millie crew.
Yeah.
That I'm afraid will keep me awake at night without knowing what the name of that dog was.
I don't think it's. Oh, we could possibly find out. I'll get in touch with one of my colleagues at the Port Lowestoft Research Society and see if it's a because if interestingly enough, if you want a physical link to the Ethel and Millie, there is one. I found it quite by chance, going through some old photographs in the record office, some glass plate negatives. I'm sure some of you are familiar. Just inside the south entrance to Bellevue Park are the so-called witches' stones by the thing. And there's a large anchor.
Oh, yeah.
That cast iron anchor. On this photograph, which was taken round about the time the anchor was placed there was a board in front of it, put up by the council, saying where it came from. And it said, this anchor was drawn up in the North Sea. It is over 200 years old. That was in 1912 it was dredged up. It gave the date. So it's now over 300 years old.
Yeah.
And but it was actually dredged up by the crew of the Ethel and Millie.
Really?
Yeah, or by the boat. Whether they were the same men who died 5 years later, I don't know. I've been hoping that somewhere or the other, we've got a memorial now to Tom Crisp in Bellevue Park, a new one that I think was on the anniversary of his death, was opened. On the other side, I'm hoping at some point I can find a way of having a memorial put there to the crew of the Ethel and Millie by the anchor from that they dredged up, just to remember them.
Yeah, that would be fitting. Yeah, and like you say, it gives it a real physical connection, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Rip through some of the comments. We've had quite a lot of comments. A few people struggling with technical gremlins, so apologies to them. But as one of them remarks, this will be available to view later if you've been struggling with connection speed or whatnot tonight. Catch up on it a second time around. So we've got greetings from South Woodham Ferrers, says Julia Barnard.
Greetings.
Greetings from the Vale of Glamorgan, says Gordon Daplin. Chris Collins says hello to Pauline Adams. And then this will take me a little while to get through. Bear with me a second. Kevin Fox. What did he say? Kevin Fox said he lived in Tonning Street for at least 10 years. I found that picture of the parachute mine, and all those gents just standing around it very boldly was quite interesting. And Chris Collins said, my great aunt Annie Playford had a shop on Tonning Street.
Yeah, that Tonning Street photograph, I don't know, it just, I like that photograph, and I like it. There you've got 8 or 9 soldiers who don't really look like soldiers, scruffy, tired, and to me they epitomise the bravery. You just got these ordinary looking guys who Douglas, bloody great, excuse my language, bomb with about 1,000 tons, 1,000 kilograms of explosive in it. They remove it from the ground and they defuse it, and they stand there looking so bored and nonchalant, but they are true heroes.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd have to agree with you there. It was a fascinating picture. Kevin Fox says, thanks once again for a very interesting evening. Always learn something new. Thank you, Kevin. And
thank you, Kevin.
Diana Carver, once again, another interesting session. Sadly missed a bit due to gremlins in the works, but we'll try to catch up later. Jackie Draper says, thanks, guys. Well, thank you to everybody watching. And,
thanks.
And thank you, Ivan. We'll see you all soon. And don't forget, as always, I like to mention that there are books available by Ivan if you are interested, because we've never had so much history, and the history certainly doesn't stop at the end of these sessions. So if you'd like a little bit more, of course, you can go back and check out all of the previous 18 episodes. Ivan has 4 books out at the moment, but 2 of them are, we think there might be waiting for reinforcements. So in the meantime, why don't you go out and try to find yourself a Return to Haunted Lowestoft, which is by Ivan Bunn and Henry Baker, and I can confirm well worth the read, well worth a buy. That'll be available in Waterstones, or perhaps you can order it from your local bookshop. Another one that is we know available is The Trial of the Lowestoft Witches. Now, this is a facsimile of the original report on the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Cullender, which Ivan has spoken about before. This features a foreword by Ivan Bunn and is edited by Henry Baker. So either one of those books, we've said before a few times, they would make excellent presents for Halloween if you're into gift giving, and why not? It's not just a spooky time of year. It's a time of year when those golden leaves encourage everybody to grab a warm blanket and cuddle up by the fire. Once again, I'm going to say thank you very much to People's Health Trust. They've been funding tonight's session. They also fund our sessions for shanties on a Tuesday night. We'll be streaming live tomorrow night. We're meeting with our Rogues Shanty Chorus in person, but we'll be broadcasting that on a live stream that we entitled Virtually Backstage. That'll be episode number 2. And once again, we say thank you to People's Health Trust for funding all of these endeavours through the Active Communities Programme. I'm going to say one last time thank you to Ivan, and thank you to everybody that watched. Good night, Ivan.
Yeah, thank you. Good night, everyone. Take care.